Allan parked his beat-up pickup truck in the driveway of Cheryl Creek Cottage, a decrepit two-story Victorian house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the porch looked like it was on the verge of collapse. But Allan saw potential where others only saw ruins. He had a knack for home renovation projects, and he was confident he could turn this run-down property into a beautiful home. He grabbed his toolbox from the back of the truck and made his way to the front door. As he unlocked it and pushed it open, he was hit with the musty smell of neglect. He grimaced, but knew that it was all part of the job. He called out to his friend Jim, who had agreed to help him with the project over the weekend. "Hey Jim, you here yet?" Allan shouted, his voice echoing in the empty house. Jim emerged from one of the rooms on the first floor, a grin on his face. "Ready to get started, boss?" he said, gesturing to the radio he had brought with him. Allan nodded, and they cranked up the volume, heavy metal music blasting through the house as they got to work. 3 months had passed since Allan started the project, and he was no closer to finishing it than he was on the day he started. He couldn't understand what the issue was. His initial inspection was thorough, and he had completed over 30 projects like this before. But every time he fixed one part of the house, more problems would surface. And if he fixed those areas, the parts he had fixed before would start falling apart again. He was frustrated and tired, but he couldn't quit now, not after investing so much of his savings and time into this project. 6 months had passed since Allan started the project, and it had taken a heavy toll on him. He had moved into the site, his savings drained. He was unable to rent an accommodation, and now all his hopes and dreams hinged on this one property. But the house had become a monster that was slowly eating away at his sanity. Allan had taken to drinking again, and after being sober for 5 long years, he had also picked up a bad cigarette habit, something he never liked, but he needed anything to take the edge off. Jim visited him regularly, concerned about his friend's well-being. He could see that Allan was losing it, and it wasn't far from the truth. In his 15 years in the business, Allan had never faced such a challenge. But he couldn't give up now, not after putting so much time, effort, and money into it. The 13th of September had arrived, 8 long and grueling months since Allan had taken on the project. He was usually a beer drinker, but on this particular night, he had brought out the heavy artillery, a large bottle of whiskey that he was swigging from as if there was no tomorrow. "What's wrong with you, you bloody house?" he shouted, his words slurring together as he took another big gulp. "Why do you keep tormenting me like this?" His army-issue Zippo lighter flickered to life as he lit a cigarette, the orange flame casting eerie shadows on the walls around him. "Screw you, you hellspawn," he muttered bitterly, the fumes of turpentine from the open canister nearby making his head swim. "Tomorrow, I'm just selling this headache off. Whatever I can get is good. I'll be free. I'll finally be free," he said before collapsing into the chair behind him. His cigarette dangled dangerously from his fingertips, forgotten in his drunken stupor. Unbeknownst to him, the lit end had dropped onto the spilled turpentine below, setting the floor and the chair ablaze. The fire spread quickly, consuming everything in its path until the entire house was engulfed in flames. The sun was just starting to rise as the newsman pulled up to the site of the burned down Cheryl Creek cottage. The smell of charred wood and smoke still hung thick in the air. Reporter Claire Matthews stepped out of the van and approached Fire Marshal Ridley, who was surveying the remains of the house. We're standing here outside Cheryl Creek Cottage, Crest Drive. Cheryl Creek, which burned down last night. It took firefighters 5 hours to curtail the flames. I have Fire Marshal Ridley here with me on the scene. Fire Marshal, can you please explain what caused this? Claire asked. Her microphone pointed towards the marshal. The marshal adjusted his hat and turned to face the camera. Hi, Claire. Looks like the cause of the fire was a lit cigarette and paint supplies. Unfortunately, one male, aged 42, was found dead inside the room from severe burn injuries. We also recovered 3 empty whiskey bottles, which probably caused him to go into an alcohol induced coma, preventing him from escaping. Claire's face twisted in horror as she struggled to process the information. This horrifying tragedy has shaken the town of Cheryl Creek, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. According to authorities, the building will now be razed down to make way for a new 2-story house. The camera panned to show the burnt out remains of the once beautiful Victorian style house. The tragedy of Allan's death hung heavy in the air. 4 months had passed since the inferno that engulfed Cheryl Creek Cottage, leaving behind nothing but ashes and a lingering sense of foreboding. The once charming abode was now a mere memory. It had been razed to the ground to pave the way for a mundane suburban house. But the wheels of fate continued to spin, and the new owners had arrived. The Alliser family had recently migrated from the hustle and bustle of the city to the tranquil suburbs, hoping to provide for their young daughter, Amelia, with a childhood of boundless freedom. With a mortgage secured, they eagerly moved into their new home on 56 Crest Drive, filled with hopes of a brighter future. The second day in the new house had dawned with a faint hint of promise. But as the day wore on, unease crept in like a whisper on the wind. The Alicers watched as their daughter Amelia played happily outside, within the fenced lawn. It was a small comfort, but one that Mrs. Alliser clung to desperately. As the evening approached, Mrs. Alliser called out to Amelia, Come in, honey, supper's ready. The little girl skipped towards the door, her hair bouncing in the breeze. Supper was over quickly, and Amelia disappeared off into the upstairs room to play with her dolls. Mrs. Alliser could hear her daughter giggling joyfully while playing with her toys. No, silly, that's to brush the doll's hair. The sound was both endearing and unsettling, a reminder of her innocence. This is the age when they make their imaginary friends, all right, she muttered to herself while cleaning the dishes, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. Suddenly, she felt a gust of cold wind, followed by the sound of a zipper lighter clicking. Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, but there was no one there. The silence in the house seemed to swell, and Mrs. Alliser's breath caught in her throat. It was then that she heard it, a faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She couldn't make out the words, but they sent shivers down her spine. As she stood there, frozen with fear, she realized that something was terribly wrong. The new house was hiding secrets, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone.